Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling tales the Appalachian Mountains have ever concealed. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments if you're watching from anywhere in the world, because anyone who enjoys dark mysteries from the past will be unnerved by what we're going to examine today. This film was made entirely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any similarity to real people living or deceased is entirely coincidental. Consider West, 1826 Virginia. Even at midday, sunlight hardly broke through the thick forests that covered the mountains, which rose like natural walls. In the past, traversing these regions required following winding paths that wound between cliffs and deep valleys, where the only sound in the stillness was the chill wind blowing down from the peaks. For those who ventured into those remote areas, civilization appeared far away, almost like a dim memory. The valleys were dotted with small settlements that were only a day's walk apart, and the law's reach was too limited to cover every shadowy corner of that untamed area. A family arose in this environment, and for generations to come, their name would be muttered in terror. Few people ventured onto the Harrow's isolated property in Greenbrier County, which was tucked between two mountains. The house was a dark, rustic wooden building with tiny windows that looked like they were watching any traveler who ventured near. Even on the hottest summer days, smoke rose from the chimney continuously as if, inside, something was constantly being prepared or destroyed. The closest neighbors, who lived far away, avoided bringing up the Harrows in conversation, and when they did, it was always in low voices and accompanied by anxious side glances. Ezekiel Harrow, a tall, skeletal man, whose presence carried a deep sense of wrongness, led the family. His voice had a horse-like tone that made anyone shudder, and his eyes were deep and empty. In the closest village he was hardly ever seen, showing up only to exchange animal hides for necessities in a silent, solitary manner. He smelled of damp earth and something else, which they couldn't identify but which made their stomachs turn, according to people who worked in the small local shops. The exact number of residents on the property was unknown, but at dusk, ghostly figures could occasionally be seen in the windows as strange, almost floating shadows. The Harrows' seclusion and ominous appearance weren't the only things that made them genuinely eerie. The few travelers who passed through that area started to notice the pattern. Occasionally, merchants who were traveling along the main route toward Kentucky or Tennessee vanished into thin air. Miles away, their wagons were discovered deserted, their goods undamaged, but the owners nowhere to be seen. Other reports described hearing screams on moonlit nights, as well as far-off echoes that appeared to originate from the mountains close to the Harrow property, but no one looked into or asked any questions. Fear served as a heavy veil to shield that family from any outside interest. When a man by the name of Thomas Wickham traveled through the area in 1826, things started to shift. Wickham was a traveling researcher who was employed by wealthy Eastern families to find relatives who had moved to the West and never returned. 3 of the names on the list he had with him matched individuals who had recently been spotted in the county Greenbrier area. Wickham resisted intimidation. He had witnessed horrific things during the war and thought that mysteries had logical justifications at all times. He started asking questions in local taverns and warehouses as soon as he got to Lewisburg, a small village. He first learned about the Harrows there. After a few whiskey drinks, an elderly merchant began to whisper stories that sounded like they belonged in a nightmare. He talked about the family's unexpected arrival in that area decades ago, and how ever since people have started to vanish from the surrounding trails. Some hunters had discovered personal items buried superficially, he said. Religious medals, wedding rings, and ripped garments in the forest. However, a sudden storm, an unexpected illness, or just the overwhelming weight of fear always stopped someone from planning a search on the Harrow property. Wickham made the decision that he had to see that location for himself. On a chilly October morning, he followed the trail that led to the mountains where the Harrows lived, defying all warnings. As he moved forward, the surrounding forest appeared to engulf him, the entwined trees, branches that create a shadowy canopy above. With every step, the air became heavier, filled with moisture and a pleasant stench of decay, which he ascribed to the dead animals strewn all over the forest. However, there was more to that smell, something that made his gut tell him to go back. The sun had already set, and the sky was a deep scarlet when he finally saw the Harrow estate. The house was encircled by uneven wooden fences and situated in the middle of a man-made clearing. There were little buildings all around it that appeared to be warehouses or barns, all equally dreary and ill-kept. Wickham could see movement through the windows, silhouettes dragging themselves back and forth as smoke billowed from the main chimney. He decided to approach on foot, dismounting his horse and tying it to a far-off tree. Every step he took in the direction of that house felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was attempting to stop him and alert him to the error he was making. He heard the creak of the door opening at that moment. Ezekiel, with a gaunt figure silhouetted against the dim interior light, Harrow emerged in the doorway. He just stood there, staring at Wickham with those piercing, empty eyes, without saying anything. Even though the investigator was shivering, he made himself walk a few meters away from the entrance. He said hello to Ezekiel and said he was trying to find anyone who had been through that place. Harrow responded with a lifeless, thin smile and an invitation that sounded more like a trap, more than hospitality. After some hesitation, Wickham consented to go inside the house. There was a voice in his head telling him not to get on his horse and return to civilization. Curiosity and duty, however, won out. The skeletal man in the doorway might have some information about the missing travelers, and he needed answers. Upon crossing the threshold, he discovered something even more unsettling than he had anticipated. The Harrow house's interior was a location where the light appeared to go out. Shadows danced on the soiled wooden walls as candles flickered in rusty candelabras. The air was oppressive, thick with odd odors that combined mold, smoke, and an unidentified organic substance. There were rickety chairs, crooked tables, shelves with dusty jars containing unknown substances and basic, sparse furniture. Then there were the people, women with blank faces, silent figures moving through the corners like ghosts, dodging the visitors' stares. Expressions stooped men who appeared to have never been exposed to sunlight. They all shared the same sense of death that Ezekiel exuded. Wickham was motioned to a chair by the fireplace, where the fire was burning with an unusual ferocity, by the patriarch. Keeping his hand close to the revolver concealed beneath his coat, he complied. With his long, bony fingers intertwined in his lap, Ezekiel sat on the opposite side, his deep eyes staring at the investigator as though they could read his mind. The subsequent discussion was one of the most bizarre things Wickham had ever encountered. Ezekiel responded to his inquiries about the travelers with ambiguous and mysterious words, constantly shifting the topic and flashing that dead smile. He talked about the Earth's mysteries, the mountains as though they were living things, and how the people who got lost in those woods never truly vanished. Rather, they changed into something else. Wickham felt his sanity being put to the test the longer he stayed in that house. The walls' shadows appeared to have a life of their own, moving apart from the flames. The other members of the family persisted in their enigmatic activities, carrying items wrapped in filthy cloths and moving up and down creaking stairs. Before he could comprehend what he had witnessed, a woman carrying what appeared to be a cloth bag passed by him. The contents of the bag moved, making a muffled sound that chilled his blood, but she vanished through a side door. Then Ezekiel abruptly shifted the topic. He started, discussing his family and how they had picked that location decades ago because it was ideal, remote, and shielded by the natural world. He clarified that they had their own laws and customs and were unconcerned with events in the outside world. The subtext was obvious, even though the words were carefully chosen. Anyone who attempted to meddle in the family's affairs simply vanished, and they functioned entirely outside of any social hierarchy, adhering only to their own dark codes. It was there, Wickham's realization of the real danger he was facing. He was no longer a questioning investigator. He had voluntarily entered the predator's lair as prey. He looked around for ways to get out, but every window was obscured by thick curtains, and every door appeared to be guarded by one of those ghostly figures. Ezekiel went on in his monotonous voice, describing the abundance of resources concealed in the shadows and the generosity of the mountains to those who knew how to exploit them. Lots of chances for people who don't care. The investigator concluded that he had to depart right away. He got up quickly, saying he had to get back before nightfall because it was getting late. However, Ezekiel's only response was a dry, humble laugh that reverberated through the house's walls. He said it would be better to stay overnight and depart in the morning, because it was too late to leave, and the trails were hazardous in the dark. There was no room for interpretation in the way he said it. It wasn't an invitation. It was a declaration. Wickham needed to figure out how to get out of the trap he had entered before it fully closed in on him. He pretended to agree and, out of concern for his horse, asked to have it checked before he retired. For a considerable amount of time, Ezekiel observed him, his lifeless eyes attempting to determine whether or not he was lying. He nodded at last, but motioned for one of the family men to go with him. Wickcham was followed to the door by a short, stocky man with a savage expression. Quiet shadow. The investigator was aware that this would be his only opportunity to take action. It was already nightfall over the mountains when they left the house. Only the dim light coming in through the Harrow property's windows broke the total darkness. Wickham felt the man staring at his back as he made his way to the spot where he had tied his horse. Despite his racing heart, he moved calmly and deliberately so as not to raise any red flags. When he got to the animal, he started to examine the saddle and reins while whispering comforting words to the agitated and uneasy horse. He took action at that point. He turned quickly and slammed the butt of his revolver into the guard. He was struck so precisely that he fell to the leaf-covered ground, unconscious. There was no time for hesitation or regret. Wickham got on his horse, gave it a good shove, and galloped down the dark path in the direction of safety. Behind him, angry voices pierced the night as he heard shouts coming from the property. He had the advantage, but he was aware that he would be hunted down and that the Harrows would make it difficult for a witness to flee. His horse was swift, and he knew the way to the village. It was an erratic and desperate ride through the forest. Stones caused his horse to falter. Branches slapped his face, and the darkness turned every shadow into a possible assailant. Wickham could not tell if the sounds he heard, footsteps, breaths, were real, or the product of his frightened imagination. He just continued to ride, propelled by the instinct for survival, hoping that the trail would return him to civilization before the Harrows pursued him, and as he ran away, one certainty pounded in his head. There was much more to that mountain family than just eccentricity and loneliness. They were cunning predators who had turned that isolated area into their personal hunting ground, where gullible tourists fell prey to sinister customs he had only just begun to comprehend. Wickham rode through the shadows until the first signs of thee. In the distance, the village started to shine. Tiny terrestrial stars that stood for civilization and security. White foam ran down the flanks of his tired horse. However, he had succeeded. After escaping the Harrow's grasp, he now possessed knowledge that should be disseminated. After hours of stress and fear, he finally arrived at Louisburg's main tavern and dismounted unsteadily, his legs hardly supporting him. The men consuming alcohol that evening gazed at him with a mixture of interest and an acknowledgement. After ordering whiskey and downing it all at once, Wickham started to describe what he had seen. He described the atmosphere of death that pervaded every part of the house where Ezekiel and his ghostly family lived. He detailed the peculiar actions, the covered items being transported, and the subtle hints regarding the traveler's destiny. However, he saw their expressions hardening and their gazes changing as he spoke. Those folks were already aware. Everybody there had always. They were aware that there was a serious problem in the mountains, but fear kept them immobilized. The silence was finally broken by one of the oldest men, a farmer named Silas. He related how some people attempted to look into the Harrows' affairs when they first arrived decades ago. They were curious about their origins, how they managed to survive in such isolation, and why they picked such a remote location. However, people who asked too many questions started to run into issues. Barns caught fire inexplicably. Livestock perished due to poisoning. Family members developed odd illnesses. It was an obvious message. Anyone who insisted on disturbing the Harrows would suffer a great deal because they wanted to be left alone. Therefore, the community closed their eyes to the horrors they suspected existed in those mountains and made a silent pact of ignorance. Wickham's chest burned with rage. How could they just put up with this? How could they let a family of predators run amok, endangering innocent tourists? However, Silas He explained that there was no true authority in that area, while shaking his head sorrowfully. Days separated us from the closest sheriff, and even if he arrived, what would he discover? A family on their own property, living in seclusion. Only whispered tales and rumors, no hard proof or unambiguous proof. The mountains were enormous, full of caverns, ravines, and locations where secrets could remain hidden forever, and the Harrows were cautious, always removing any trace that might implicate them. Wickham, however, was a man who did not give up easily. In the subsequent days, he started to collect data in a more methodical manner. He talked to the families of adventurers who went west and vanished close to County Greenbrier, and merchants who never came back from their travels. The macabre puzzle gained a new piece with each story. He found a trend. People traveling alone or in small groups, typically with valuable items or life savings, were always the victims. They were specifically chosen targets, individuals whose absence would be difficult to observed, whose location would never be thoroughly examined. Wickham made the more radical decision in 1827. After traveling to the nearby county, he was able to persuade a magistrate to issue an official order for an investigation into the Harrow property. It wasn't simple. Wickham presented his list of missing persons, the testimonies he had gathered, and his personal experience in that family's home to the hesitant and doubtful magistrate. Ultimately, the official consented to set up an journey into the mountains, bringing a few armed men who were legally permitted to search the land. The village responded differently to the news, which spread swiftly. Some rejoiced, believing that those who had long operated in the shadows would finally receive justice. Others were frightened, fearing that if the investigation produced no hard evidence, the Harrows would retaliate. And some people just didn't think anything would be discovered, because the Harrows were too cunning, constantly one step ahead of any danger. The journey began on an overcast spring morning. The 12 men were led by Wickham at the front, along the meandering path that led into the mountains. A burly, middle-aged man named Cornelius Wade, the magistrate, rode beside him with the official documents and a determined yet nervous expression on his face. Armed with rifles and pistols, the other men were a mixture of hired mercenaries and courageous bystanders, ready for anything. As they got closer, the property, the mood clearly shifted. The air felt heavier, the forest appeared denser, and even the horses were reluctant to go on. It seemed as though the natural world worked together to keep the secrets hidden. Wickham's heart pounded as he was overcome with flashbacks to the night of his escape. However, it was not the same this time. The law was on his side, and he wasn't alone. They discovered something unexpected when they eventually came out into the clearing where the Harrow property was located. The residents remained quiet. There was no movement at the windows, and no smoke coming from the chimney. The windows and doors stood open, swaying a little in the breeze. The location appeared to have been quickly deserted. With their weapons drawn, the group dismounted and approached cautiously, but they met with no opposition. The house was deserted. There were obvious indications of a hurried departure inside. Open drawers, overturned furniture, and items strewn all over the floor. Any overt signs of the Harrows' activities had been taken with them when they fled. However, they hadn't been flawless. The team started discovering items as they looked around the property. Tiny, personal belongings concealed in wall crevices. Rings, medals, and pieces of cloth that are obviously the property of travelers. Objects that conveyed unspoken tales of people who had gone through and were never seen again. They discovered something in one of the barns that supported their worst fears. There were unsettling indications of nefarious activities that had taken place there over the years. Cornelius Wade gave the order for an extensive examination of the property, and every new room turned up more hints about the family's sinister activities, including secret documents, maps indicating remote paths, and records pointing to a methodical pattern of tracking visitors. Secrets had been kept on the Harrow estate for decades, and horrors had gone unchecked because there was no surveillance. However, the Harrows themselves had vanished, running far into the Appalachian Mountains to conceal themselves for years or even eternally. It was a straightforward and terrifying question that plagued Wickham and all the others. How many other families were there in the isolated areas of the United States, endangering innocent people far from the law's sight, if the Harrows were able to operate there for such a long time without being caught? The findings on that deserted property were sufficient to establish that a serious problem had occurred there. Once again, however, the criminals themselves had gotten away with it. Wickham surveyed the area. Mountains, aware that the Harrows were reassembling somewhere beyond those heights, possibly already preparing to relocate to another equally isolated area. He knew that in order to finally bring that family to justice, he would need more than just perseverance. The hunt was far from over. Like wildfire in a dry forest, word of the findings on the Harrow property spread throughout the nearby towns and villages. People's reactions were a mix of horror and confirmation that the long-rumored information had finally been verified. However, a new kind of fear was brought on by the confirmation. What else might be concealed in the forgotten creases of that untamed land if the Harrows were real and had been able to operate in the shadows for so long? After the discovery, Wickham stayed in the area for weeks, assisting Cornelius Wade in recording everything they discovered and attempting to identify the recovered personal items. He wrote letters to the families who had hired him in the first place, delivering news that nobody wanted to hear but that at least provided a gloomy sort of resolution. Their loved ones hadn't just chosen to start over in faraway places or gotten lost on the trails. They had perished at the hands of human predators who took advantage of the mountain's seclusion to carry out their evil deeds. But Wickham kept thinking about the Harrows that had escaped while he worked in that temporary cemetery. Somewhere in the mountains, Ezekiel and his ghostly family were likely waiting for the storm to pass while keeping a close eye on things. He was aware that people that didn't just quit their routines. They would relocate, set up a new base, and carry on with their activities. Years of success and impunity had shaped their nature. Cornelius Wade had similar worries. He sent out warnings to all nearby counties, set up patrols to search the surrounding mountains, and offered rewards for information on the family's whereabouts. However, the Appalachian Mountains were enormous and dangerous, with trails that went nowhere, deep valleys, and secret caverns. It was like trying to locate ghosts in a dense fog when looking for the Harrows. They were the most familiar with that area. After decades of learning every natural hiding place and secret route, months went by with no sign of the family, and life in the villages gradually resumed as usual, albeit with increased caution around strangers and travelers. People avoided going alone on isolated trails, locked their doors more frequently, and regarded any property that was too alone. The entire area was shrouded in paranoia as a result of the Harrows' legacy. The first rumors started to reappear in 1828. Further south, a merchant passing through Monroe County claimed to have seen an odd family residing in an abandoned cabin close to the Virginia border. He spoke of a tall, skeletal man, pale people who avoided making eye contact, and a deathly atmosphere that pervaded the space. The story made Wickham's blood run cold. Of course, it might just be a coincidence, but something in. The description struck a deep chord in his mind. He made the decision to look into it himself, but this time he was better prepared. He assembled a handful of reliable men, all of whom had served in the military or were seasoned hunters, and headed for Monroe County. Days were spent traveling through rough terrain and thick forests. The signs were present, but when they eventually found the cabin the trader had described, they discovered another deserted location. Food scraps, fresh ashes in the fireplace, and that distinct smell that Wickham would never forget. Although the Harrows had previously visited, they left before being apprehended. Always falling behind and getting there too late was like chasing shadows. Wickham came to understand that this family had a network of informants, people who alerted authorities to questionable activities and shared information in return for dubious favors or just out of fear. The wickedness of the Harrows was not unique to them. Others actively or passively shielded them by remaining silent. Of all the revelations, this one was probably the most unsettling. A whole unofficial system of protection that permitted such atrocities to persist was the issue, not just a family of predators. Wickham realized that the Harrows' exposure had only touched the surface of a much larger and more profound problem. In the mountains, there was a subculture of people who lived entirely outside of civilized law and viewed strangers and travelers as resources to be taken advantage of rather than as fellow humans. In the same year, Wickham met Margaret Ashwood, a woman who had survived a similar family encounter years earlier. She was traumatized by events she hardly talked about, and she lived a solitary life on a small farm. However, after learning about the Harrows, she felt compelled to share her story. She described how, while traveling with her husband as a young woman, they were tricked into going to a remote location under the pretense of hospitality. There, she observed peculiar customs and actions. That went against all reasonable reasoning. Only by taking advantage of a brief moment of distraction and running into the woods while her husband remained behind was she able to escape. He was never seen by Margaret again. Before discovering a village, she lived for days in the forest, consuming roots and drinking water from streams. She attempted to report the incident, but nobody took her seriously. They claimed that she was delirious and that her mental state was impacted by the trauma of losing her husband. She thus learned to keep her horrors to herself and to remain silent. However, now that you know that the Harrows had been revealed, she felt compelled to verify that the monsters she had witnessed were real and that she wasn't insane. Wickham listened uneasily as she told her story. The harrow phenomenon was only a symptom of something bigger, if Margaret was telling the truth, and he had no reason to doubt it. Throughout the most isolated mountainous areas, there were other families and clans that operated similarly, each using different strategies but all adhering to the same basic: lack of humanity, the same ability to regard other people as nothing more than prey. He started gathering as much information as he could, including testimonies from survivors like Margaret, tales from tourists who had barely avoided odd circumstances, and records of individuals who had just disappeared in particular areas. There was a pattern. Locals instinctively avoided certain areas in the Appalachian Mountains where disappearances were more common, and there were whispers of rumors in each of these areas, concerning solitary households and individuals who disregarded social norms. Wickham came to the realization that he had devoted his life to something much more important than merely finding missing family members. He was charting a terrifying geography, pinpointing areas where human darkness flourished unchecked and civilization had failed to penetrate. And the more he dug, the more he realized how big the problem was. How do you combat a faceless foe that always hides in the shadows and runs away before it can? Confronted. The years that followed changed Wickham as a person. Every part of his life was consumed by his obsession with tracking down the harrows and exposing others who were similar to them. Talking to locals and following clues that frequently led to dead ends but occasionally revealed disturbing truths, he was always moving through the mountains. Notes, maps with warnings about suspicious areas, names of families who lived too far away, and accounts that didn't make sense until linked to other people. He traveled to the Kentucky mountains in 1830, where there were rumors of a whole community that had cut itself off from the outside world decades earlier. It wasn't just a family like the Harrows, it was a larger group, maybe 50 or more, who lived according to their own laws in a place so far away that not even seasoned hunters went there. Wickham was aware that exploring that location would be even riskier than his initial expedition onto the Harrow property, but he also realized he couldn't disregard the possibility that a terrible thing was taking place there. He gathered information in the nearby villages for weeks. The isolated community was referred to as the Mountain People by the locals, who discussed it in hushed tones. They claimed to occasionally trade timber and furs, but only through middlemen and never in person. There were tales of strange noises heard on moonless nights, of hunters who had ventured too near to their territory and never returned, of enigmatic lights that at specific times of the year danced among the trees. Wickham concluded that a different strategy was required. He would attempt to infiltrate, watch from a distance, and gather evidence before taking action, rather than going straight after the community. In exchange for a substantial payment, he hired Joshua, a local guide who was well-versed in the mountains, to take him to the area where the mountain people lived. Joshua was a cautious and taciturn man who succeeded in. He made it apparent right away that he would not go any closer than that. He didn't want to put his life in danger like that. It was a long and difficult journey, climbing steep slopes covered in dense vegetation and traversing deep ravines. Joshua became more anxious as they went along, looking around all the time as though he thought someone might be watching him. He related tales he had heard as a child about how the people who founded that community were escaping something. Maybe the law, maybe something worse. They had specifically picked that location because it was inaccessible, allowing them to live freely and do as they pleased without interference from the outside world. Wickham continued by himself after they eventually got to a point where Joshua would not go any further. Leaving his horse behind, he walked through the forest stealthily, employing every camouflage tactic he had picked up over the years of research. He had to walk carefully for 2 days before he noticed the first indications of human habitation. People were moving between rudimentary huts strewn throughout a secret valley, smoke rising from multiple hearths. Wickham located a well-lit high spot and took up residence there, using the binoculars he had brought. Over the course of the following few hours, he witnessed both ordinary and unsettling things. People were carrying water, working with wood, and tending gardens, all seemingly routine tasks. However, there was a mechanical rigidity to the way they moved, as though they were carrying out duties out of duty rather than voluntarily. And then there were the forbidden places, those huts that nobody went near except for a select few, always with something covered. Wickham saw something during the night that made his blood run cold. Around a big bonfire in the middle of the valley, the locals gathered. From a distance, he was unable to fully understand the ritual that was initiated by hooded figures who formed a circle. Chants in a language he was unfamiliar with were heard. Coordinated motions that resembled a dance and a passionate atmosphere that was evident even from a distance. This was not merely a remote community. It was something more profound and structured, possibly a cult with its own perverted ideologies. Wickham became aware that he had discovered something that was too big for him to manage on his own. Unlike the Harrows, this was not a family of opportunistic predators. It had a hierarchy and a full structure. He could hardly understand the rituals and purposes, and any attempt at exposure would require resources far beyond what he had because of the number of people involved. To handle the situation, higher-level authorities would need to be involved, possibly including the military. He continued to observe for 3 more days, taking notes on everything he saw in an effort to map out the community's organizational structure. He marked locations that appeared particularly significant or guarded, recognized patterns in daily routines, and determined who appeared to be the leaders. However, something changed on the 4th day. Everything. They found him. A member of the community, probably a lookout who patrolled the neighborhood, discovered his hiding spot. Wickham didn't realize the man was there until it was too late. Before he could react, he felt a hard object hit his head as a figure, silent as a ghost, stepped out from the trees behind him. The agony was severe but fleeting, and then he was engulfed in a total blackness. He was in one of his cabins when he realized what had happened. Seen from a distance, his head ached, his hands and feet were bound with thick ropes. He was strapped to a chair, and when he attempted to focus his vision, he saw multiple figures silently observing him. They were both men and women of various ages, and they all had the same vacant look that he had noticed in the Harrow family. It seemed as though a person's basic humanity had been taken away from them, leaving behind nothing but hollow shells that were driven by sinister intent. An elderly man came over his stance, implying power. His eyes were deeply sunken, his beard was long and gray, and his clothes were plain but oddly adorned with symbols Wickham did not understand. His voice was unexpectedly quiet, almost mesmerizing, but it carried an unavoidable implicit threat. Without having to say it out loud, he made it obvious that the answers to his questions about Wickham's identity, purpose, and sender would determine whether or not the investigator would survive in that cabin. Wickham was aware of an position that is impossible. Telling the truth would require him to acknowledge that he posed a direct threat to the community's secrets, but lying could be easily caught. He chose to be only partially truthful, stating that his trail had brought him to that area and that he was an investigator hired to find missing people. Neither the Harrows nor his suspicions about cults in the mountains were mentioned. He gave the impression that he was just carrying out his duties without any malicious intent. The older man's eyes never left as he listened in silence. Wickham's face. A prolonged period of silence followed the investigator's conclusion, during which time fate appeared to hang on an unseen scale. Surprisingly, the man grinned. It was a smile that stopped short of his icy, cunning eyes. He expressed gratitude for the candor. However, Wickham had trespassed on his land, which was a fatal error. There were only two choices now that he had seen what he should not have seen. Never leave those mountains unless you join them. The weight of those words hit Wickham like. He had stones on his chest. He would have to give up everything he was and become a part of the same evil he had spent years battling if he joined them. The alternative was too obvious to require further explanation. He had to buy time, find a way out, or at the very least sow doubt that would work in his favor. So he did something out of the ordinary. He inquired as to why they had decided to live that way, what it meant to be a part of that community, and what it meant to join them. The question seemed to pique the interest of the older man. He motioned for everyone else to exit the cabin, and he pulled up a chair and took a seat across from Wickham once they were alone. He started talking, and what he disclosed was a perverted philosophy that sought to defend the unreasonable. He clarified that those who disapproved of the morals and laws enforced by civilized society founded this community. Such structures, in their opinion, were artificial, like chains that restricted the essence of humanity. In the mountains, away from the world's critical gaze, they could live in accordance with older, more archaic ideas that dictated order and that the weak existed to serve the powerful. This worldview, which reduced human existence to a harsh hierarchy based on dominance and power, was extremely unsettling. Silently, Wickham listened, realizing that he was up against more than just criminals. These individuals had created a whole ideological system to defend their behavior, turning cruelty into a principle and evil into philosophy. What was even more horrifying was the way the man spoke calmly, as if he were talking about something entirely logical and reasonable. Next, the leader offered a suggestion. Wickham would have time to think things through. He would be held under observation there, observing how the community operated, learning its values, and possibly recognizing the alleged truth they had found. He would be accepted if, after this time, he truly chose to join them. If he declined, there were plenty of locations on the mountain where people might vanish into thin air. Wickham clung to it like a lifeline, even though it was obviously an illusion of choice. He needed time to figure out how to get out. Wickham was kept under continual observation in one of the huts for the next few days. He was permitted to accompany people on walks through the valley, watch people going about their daily lives, and even have conversations with some of the locals. What he found was frightening as well as fascinating. Not everyone in that group was equally devoted to the leader's sinister ideology. Many had been lured there by assurances of independence and self-sufficiency, only to find they had switched prisons. But once inside, it was hard to get out. Watchmen who knew every trail guarded the surrounding mountains, and deserters were not tolerated in the community. He pointed out some people who didn't seem as convinced as others. Years ago, a woman named Sarah had come there to escape an abusive marriage, only to find something worse. Daniel, a young man who had been taken there. As a boy, and had only known that lifestyle, but whose innate humanity resisted brainwashing. When the guards weren't looking, Wickham whispered words and started to carefully weave doubt. Questions that caused those individuals to wonder if this was actually freedom or merely a new kind of slavery. He had a dangerous plan. His sentence would be executed right away if the leaders found out he was attempting to erode community unity. Wickham, however, was wagering that there were flaws in that structure, individuals who secretly yearned to flee but lacked the bravery or resources to do so on their own. There might be a chance for a group escape if he could bring some of them together. When the guards were preoccupied with getting ready for another nightly ritual, Sarah was the one who eventually approached him. It was impossible to do it alone, she whispered. But there were others like her, people who were forced to stay there and were waiting for a chance to get out. Without knowledge, the mountains were a maze. Any fugitive would become lost and perish from starvation or cold before coming across civilization if they didn't follow the right trails. Wickham said they could be taken to safety if they could get in touch with him, as he had a guide waiting for him days away. Over the next few days, a plan started to take shape. 5 other people who were prepared to risk everything for a chance at freedom were surreptitiously gathered by Sarah. Daniel would be important because, despite being raised in the neighborhood, he occasionally went on patrol and was at least somewhat familiar with the paths that emerged from the valley. The next nightly ritual would be the selected time, when the guards would be outnumbered at the camp's edges and everyone's attention would be on the ceremony. The crescent moon, which was partially hidden by clouds on the night of the escape, provided both enough light for navigation and enough darkness for hiding. Wickham and his small group of runaways were gathered around the central campfire as the community's chants reverberated throughout the valley. Started to move. They had prepared small backpacks with the food, water, and other items they would need for the trip, which they had stolen over the days. Daniel took the lead and led them down a route that avoided the typical watchtowers. The strain was intolerable. Underfoot, every splintered branch sounded like a gunshot. They persisted, going as fast as they dared without creating much noise, even though every wind whisper through the trees sounded like the voices of pursuers. Wickham remained in the back, always, determining whether they were being followed. It appeared for hours that they would be successful. They left the valley behind, ascended a steep slope, and started to go down the opposite side, toward the location where he hoped to see Joshua once more when they heard it. The mountains reverberated with distant cries. The hunt had started after the escape was found. Wickham was aware that the locals were seasoned hunters who were familiar with those mountains and would not tolerate deserters. He exhorted the group to, on, letting go of any pretense of quiet in favor of rapidity. Now, as panic drove their movements, they ran, stumbling over roots and scraping against bushes. Daniel halted abruptly, confused. He had lost his sense of direction in the panic and the darkness. They had no idea which way would bring them to safety and were lost in the mountains with oncoming pursuers. Sarah started sobbing quietly. Wickham forced himself to maintain composure and reason as the reality of their dire circumstances finally dawned on him. He gazed at the stars, partially visible through the clouds, attempting to remember the general path they had taken when they first arrived. He pointed after estimating as best he could. They would have to depend on providence and luck. They traveled through the pitch-black forest like lost souls in a nightmare, following Wickham's instructions. They could see torchlight snaking between distant trees, and the cries behind them seemed closer now. The time until they were surpassed was just around the corner. However, when hope was on the verge of extinction, they heard a horse neighing, which was different. As he had promised, Wickham waited patiently as he ran towards the sound and came out into a small clearing where Joshua had made camp. There was no time for explanations, but the guide was startled to see not just Wickham, but an entire group of people coming out of the forest, clearly fleeing in desperation. Joshua only heard Wickham say, "Run," and didn't need to hear anything else. Anticipating potential issues, he had brought extra horses, and now that forecast turned out to be life-saving. The irate cries of their assailants gradually faded into the distance as the group swiftly mounted and galloped through the mountains in the direction of civilization. Each of them was tested to the limit of their endurance during the ride through the darkness. The horses were worn out. The fugitives could hardly remain mounted, and they waited for the sound of pursuers coming out of the darkness at every turn. However, as the night gave way to dawn and the hours went by, they became aware that they had been successful. The mountain community had not apprehended them, either because they believed it was too dangerous to pursue fugitives in uncharted territory or because they simply accepted that they would lose. The group was in danger of collapsing both physically and psychologically when they eventually arrived at the closest village. Wickham started setting up protection for the runaways as soon as Joshua led them to a resting place at an inn. In order to rebuild their lives, Sarah and the others needed safe havens, distant from the reach of the society that had imprisoned them. He made use of his connections, solicited favors, and eventually set up circumstances for each of them in separate villages, far enough away to allow them to start over. Wickham, however, kept thinking about the community that was still in the mountains as he cared for the people he had set free. Numerous individuals remained, some voluntarily, but many confined by circumstance or fear. He was also aware that there were other groups dispersed throughout the isolated areas in addition to that particular one. Tiny areas of darkness where unspeakable horrors could thrive unnoticed and the law never reached. He concluded that he had to take more significant action. He made his way to Virginia's capital, Richmond, where he was able to meet with important government figures. He shared everything he had learned over the years, including testimonies from survivors, maps he had created that highlighted questionable areas, and thorough explanations of how these remote communities functioned. He begged for government action to provide resources to examine and destroy these networks of predatory humans that use isolation as a defense. There was a mixed response. His worries were taken seriously by some officials, who recognized that the westward expansion had produced large areas with almost no legal authority. Others, however, were dubious, claiming that there were not enough resources and that it was not feasible to give remote communities priority over more pressing issues in more developed regions. Wickham had to deal with red tape, apathy, and even charges of exaggeration. Realizing that getting the authorities to take action was a struggle in and of itself, even with hard evidence, was frustrating. However, he persisted. After months of lobbying and making arguments in Richmond, he was able to persuade a group of lawmakers to authorize funding for research trips to far-flung areas. Although it wasn't all he had hoped for, it was a beginning. They started organizing small patrols. Local authorities now have more investigative authority, distinct properties, and a communication network was set up to allow various counties to exchange information about questionable activities. Wickham returned to the Kentucky mountains in 1832, this time with a formal force of 20 armed men, who were under a court order to look into the community that had imprisoned him. However, they discovered nothing but ruins when they reached the secret valley. There was no sign of human life, the cabins were burned, and the ground was covered in abandoned items. The neighborhood had disappeared, either dispersing into the mountains or relocating to an even more isolated area after becoming aware of the approaching expedition. In the years that followed, the pattern would recur numerous times. The members of these remote communities simply vanished into the vast and unmanageable Appalachian landscape whenever authorities attempted to intervene against them. It was similar to attempting to capture mist with your hands, and Wickham started to think that there might never be a conclusive answer. Simply put, there were too many people willing to live outside of civilized norms. The mountains were too large, and they were too far away. However, he also noticed advancements. In areas with more surveillance, traveler disappearances declined. The survivors he had assisted in freeing started sharing their stories publicly, and local communities became more active in reporting suspicious activity, increasing awareness of the threats that lurk in forgotten places. The darkness was being driven back very, very slowly. At this time, Wickham, additionally, focused on the original Harrows, the family who had initiated his journey. He continued to gather any rumors or sightings that might be related to Ezekiel and his spectral relatives, whom he had never forgotten. Over the years, there were intermittent reports of an odd family living in various places, always in isolated areas, and always avoiding contact. But it was impossible to determine with certainty whether they were the Harrows or simply another family of a similar nature. At that moment, he got a letter from. The magistrate in charge of the initial inquiry into the Harrow estate was Cornelius Wade. Wade wrote to let him know that a very old and sick man had shown up in a border village in Tennessee and claimed to know something about the Harrows. He wanted to confess before he died because he was dying. Wickham went there right away and got there in time to talk to the man during his last days. The dying man disclosed that he had occasionally collaborated with the Harrows, serving as an middleman to sell the goods the family bought from their victims. Now that he was nearing the end of his life, he wanted to get rid of the guilt he had carried for decades. He described how the Harrows had made their home in a particular part of North Carolina that was so remote that even the most accurate maps failed to show it. He begged Wickham to see to it that they were finally brought to justice, and listed geographic landmarks that might be used to find them. With this knowledge, Wickham planned the expedition that would be his last. Despite his advanced age and weariness from years of pursuit, he felt compelled to finish it. He assembled a small but trustworthy team of men, all of whom had served on earlier expeditions and were aware of the dangers. Following the dying man's instructions, they set out on a chilly autumn morning, exploring areas that appeared to have been forgotten over time. Weeks were spent traveling through difficult terrain that put both horses and men to the test. However, after tracing the landmarks as described, they discovered evidence of human habitation in a deep ravine encircled by precipitous cliffs. With only one narrow, easily defended path leading to it, it was the ideal location for someone who wished to stay hidden. Wickham shivered with recognition. The atmosphere of death and the deliberate seclusion there were reminiscent of the Harrow family's original estate in West Virginia. At dusk, they moved cautiously closer, hiding behind the deepening darkness. Wickham used binoculars to view a rustic cabin with figures moving around it. He then saw Ezekiel Harrow, who had been haunting his nightmares for years. He was older and more stooped, but he was still clearly the same skeletal man with empty eyes. Wickham had at last located the patriarch of the family that had initiated it all, after all the escapes and pursuits. Throughout the night, Wickham observed the Harrow property, learning more about the family's reorganization in this new haven with each passing hour. It was possible that there were only 6 or 7 of them left, and appeared more wary and suspicious. The perimeter was dotted with crude traps, and bells suspended from nearly undetectable ropes alerted anyone approaching. The Harrows were even harder to catch because they had learned from their mistakes. Wickham assembled his men to talk strategy at dawn. They couldn't just storm the property because that would lead to a potentially fatal violent altercation. However, they were unable to hold the area for an extended period of time because they didn't have the necessary materials. One of his friends, Curtis, who had participated in military operations, came up with the solution. He proposed to cut off the Harrows' only means of escape, making it impossible for them to flee via the narrow path, and then approaching the situation diplomatically by offering terms of surrender. It was a good idea. Perhaps the Harrows would consent to a peaceful surrender if they realized they were totally encircled and had no way out, as they had in the past. It was a risk, naturally, because individuals such as Ezekiel seldom gave up without a fight. However, it was worth a shot. Wickham and the others stayed in the high spot where they could see the cabin, and half of his men blocked the way out. Wickham went down to a point where his voice could reach the property when the sun was high. He yelled Ezekiel's name, introduced himself, and clarified that armed men with legal authority were encircling the location. He provided the chance for a peaceful surrender, with the assurance that if they cooperated, they would be given a fair trial. There was a long, tense silence. Through the windows of the cabin, Wickham could see shadows deliberating and making decisions. The door opened at last. When Ezekiel came out, he appeared even more cadaverous than Wickham had recalled. Even after years of running away and a difficult life in the mountains, those eyes were still piercing and empty. Examining Wickchick with an unsettling fervor, the elderly predator's words, which were a mix of defiance and resignation, were spoken in a hoarse voice. He claimed to have known that the time would come when you could no longer run indefinitely. However, he also made it apparent that he didn't regret his decisions and wasn't pleading for forgiveness. Hunter and prey had a bizarre conversation after that. Ezekiel discussed his life philosophy, arguing that civilized society was a fabrication designed to shield the weak from the powerful, but it was unclear who was who. Powerful. He considered his acts to be manifestations of a basic truth about human nature rather than crimes. It was unsettling to hear such statements made with such conviction, as though he genuinely thought his immorality made sense. Wickham retorted that despite erroneous ideologies, human society was governed by laws, and he had broken the most basic of them. Wickham recognized Ezekiel's lifeless smile. Unexpectedly, he then gave a nod of agreement. He promised to give up, but on one state. Not out of regret, but rather out of a kind of perverse pride and a desire for his deeds to be remembered. He wanted to share his entire story and leave a record of everything he had done and why. Wickham agreed after he hesitated. It was worth listening to a monster's confessions if it meant finally apprehending the Harrows without using force. The family was apprehended without any problems. They were driven back across the mountains, a trip that took several days and garnered a lot of attention. Through towns and villages. When the notorious Harrows were finally captured, people came out of their houses, some looking satisfied, others still showing signs of fear. The word got out fast, and by the time they reached the county where they would stand trial, a crowd had already formed. Wickham spent hours interviewing Ezekiel and recording his confessions in the weeks preceding the trial. What he heard was a decades-long account of atrocities that started long before. In West Virginia, the family made their home. Ezekiel explained how they selected their victims, how they had refined their techniques over time, and how they made sure no evidence was left behind. More unsettling than any expression of regret would have been was the emotional distance with which he discussed it all. Wickham, however, noticed more in the subtext as Ezekiel spoke. The Patriarch of Harrow wasn't exactly bragging about what he had done. He was creating a story in an attempt to defend them to himself, where he was just someone who recognized realities that others did not want to believe, not a monster. He needed to feel that his evil had a purpose in order to protect himself psychologically. Wickham saw it for what it was, the human mind's search for purpose, even in the most sinister deeds. The trial was an event that attracted regional attention. The courtroom was overcrowded as people traveled from all over to testify. The accounts of survivors such as Margaret, Ashwood were terrible, providing a clear illustration of the family's predatory tendencies. They produced tangible proof that had been retrieved from the original West Virginia property. Each personal item symbolized a life lost, and Ezekiel's own admissions, despite their seeming lack of regret, sealed his doom. The verdict was swift and unanimous, finding the defendant guilty on several counts. Ezekiel remained silent as the sentence was read, seemingly listening to the seriousness of the crimes. The destiny of another person is being determined. Depending on their roles and circumstances, the other family members were given different sentences. Some were obviously both victims and offenders, having been coerced or coerced into taking part. Others were equally guilty but willing collaborators. Wickham experienced a wide range of complicated emotions following the trial. There was a sense of emptiness mixed with the satisfaction of having finally brought the Harrows to justice. That pursuit had taken up so many years of his life. And now that. He didn't know what to do with himself now that it was over. Who was he without his mission, which had come to define him? Wickham made an effort to return to a more typical life in the months that followed. He made his home in a peaceful village and tried to find solace in the mundane activities of daily life. But the mountains never stopped calling to him, whispering of other undiscovered mysteries and other families, like the Harrows, who persisted in their clandestine activities. He was aware that his work would never be fully finished because as long as there. Predators would take advantage of the gaps in the law in isolated areas. However, he was also aware of his limitations. He was older and tired from years of danger and pursuit. He had dedicated his life to bringing the atrocities concealed in the mountains to light. It was now time to hand the reins to a new generation of law enforcement officers and investigators who could carry on the work he had started. Wickham started writing, recording everything he owned, learned, producing a manual for his successors. It was his method of making sure that the knowledge he had gained through so much sacrifice would not be lost. He also considered what he had discovered along the way as he wrote. Without social norms and common morals, human nature could descend into extreme darkness. People were psychologically and geographically isolated, which made it possible for them to justify horrible deeds. The most significant lesson, perhaps, was that evil. Seldom did it show itself as an obvious monstrosity. It frequently took the form of philosophy, twisted reasoning, or sincere believers in their own right. It took constant watchfulness and the guts to challenge even what appeared reasonable on the surface to identify and fight such evil. Wickham's writings turned into an invaluable resource for anyone wishing to learn about the murky corners of far-off places. He wrote about more general trends in addition to the Harrows and the Kentucky community had seen over the course of his years of research. He explained how social norms could be totally rewritten in isolated areas where small groups formed their own laws that frequently ran counter to everything that society held sacred. Others with comparable experiences became interested in his work. Investigators, sheriffs, and even survivors who identified the patterns Wickham described started sending letters from all over the United States. Every letter that was added, an additional component to the unsettling mosaic he was creating. It became evident that the Appalachians were not the only region affected. Isolated communities operating under principles that went against the established order were reported in the Louisiana swamps, the remote northern territories, and the Rocky Mountains. Elias Monroe, a man who documented westward expansion, was one particularly fascinating correspondent. Monroe had come up with his own explanation for the emergence of these kinds of communities. He maintained that the size of the American frontiers left a void that was impossible for centralized authority to fill. Alternative power structures, some benign but others extremely disruptive, arose in this void. It was an issue rooted in the nation's geography that might never be completely solved as long as there were large uncharted areas. Although Wickham agreed with Monroe's analysis, he also thought that psychological factors were involved. Isolation appealed to some people, specifically because they felt constrained by norms and expectations and wanted to break free from the confines of civilized society, not necessarily because they had criminal intentions from the start. However, once isolated, the lack of external moral frameworks permitted darker impulses to thrive unbridled. What started out as a quest for independence eventually turned into something much darker. Eventually, as a result of this communication with Monroe and others, an unofficial network of individuals committed to keeping an eye on and looking into questionable activities in isolated areas. It was a collection of people exchanging information and working together when needed, rather than an official organization. Wickham developed into a sort of hub in this network, a knowledge base that people could consult when they ran into situations they didn't fully comprehend. 3 years after the Harrows were taken, in 1835, a village in the Pennsylvania mountains sent Wickham an urgent request for assistance. Over the past year, people had vanished, always while following a particular trail that passed through a particularly isolated area. The locals thought there might be a family living alone close to that trail, but they were hesitant to look into it without the right help. Even though he was old and tired, Wickham had to answer. He was reminded that he was no longer the young man who had started this journey years ago by the arduous and drawn-out trip to Pennsylvania. However, upon reaching the village and learning the specifics, the patterns he was so familiar with were instantly recognized. All of the telltale symptoms were present in the suspected family. Extreme isolation, evasive behavior when meeting others, reports of strange activity seen from a distance. It was similar to going back to his initial research. Wickham didn't have to do it alone, though, this time. He could call for help through the network he had helped create. A team of seasoned investigators arrived on the scene in a matter of weeks, each contributing their expertise, learned from their personal experiences. Together, they carried out a thorough and methodical investigation, obtaining information before taking any immediate action. The worst suspicions were confirmed by what they found. The family in question had been using techniques that were uncannily similar to the Harrows' methods to prey on travelers for years. However, in contrast to Ezekiel's experience, this time the intervention was prompt and effective. The evidence was appropriately preserved, the family was apprehended without suffering severe injuries, and a trial was carried out in accordance with all relevant legal procedures. That procedure was a form of validation for Wickham. A well-coordinated team was now successfully applying everything he had learned from years of trial and error, mistakes he had made, and lessons he had absorbed. It was evidence that advancement was feasible, and that systematic monitoring and information exchange could be used to combat the darkness that flourished in seclusion. However, despite his joy at the achievement, Wickham understood that it was just one triumph in a much bigger conflict. How many predatory communities remained hidden for each one that was discovered and destroyed? There were innumerable isolated valleys, deep gorges, and thick forests in the Appalachian Mountains alone, where mysteries might be kept hidden for many generations. Large areas of land beyond the Appalachians remained unexplored and uncolonized. He started thinking about long-term fixes. He penned recommendations for lawmakers arguing that the scope of the law should be increased. Enforcement in isolated areas. He recommended setting up outposts in key locations to serve as reporting points for suspicious activity rather than to manage the populace. He suggested enhancing interjurisdictional communication systems to facilitate the faster exchange of criminal information. While some of his suggestions were adopted, others were rejected because they were too costly or impractical. However, he noticed changes occurring very slowly. Knowledge of the risks associated with. The number of isolated areas was increasing. There were fewer truly remote locations where predators could operate with total impunity as a result of civilization's westward expansion, and communities were growing more proactive in taking care of one another. Additionally, Wickham worked with survivors, assisting them in reconstructing their lives following traumatic events. In this endeavor, Sarah, the woman who had assisted him in leaving the Kentucky community, became a close ally. She was the one who understood the most. What it meant to get out of such circumstances, and her strength and compassion encouraged others to have the guts to go on. For those who had survived interactions with predatory communities, they established a sort of unofficial support system. Through this work, Wickham got to know Benjamin, a young man who, like the Harrows, had grown up in a remote family but had escaped at an early age. Benjamin had a distinct viewpoint because he had experienced that lifestyle firsthand while maintaining. enough of humanity to see its reversibility. He talked about how kids were brainwashed in those settings, how normalcy was totally redefined when you were exposed to nothing else, and how hard it was to break thought patterns that had been ingrained since childhood. Wickham's comprehension of the problem's cyclical nature was enhanced by these discussions. It was important to break cycles of abuse and brainwashing that could continue in addition to punishing offenders. Between generations. Benjamin and others who were able to flee and acknowledge the peculiarity of their origins were uncommon. Many others continued to follow the same patterns that had been forced upon them, trapped either physically or mentally. As the years went by, Wickham witnessed his initial goal shift from apprehending particular offenders to a more comprehensive endeavor to comprehend and address the factors that made such circumstances possible. Although the work would never really end, it was one that could have a noticeable impact on people's lives. And maybe that was the most important thing after all, not the delusion of total triumph, but the unwavering dedication to combating evil wherever it materialized. A tiny cabin on the edge of the mountains that had shaped so much of Wickham's life was where he spent his last years. As though they were now a part of him, he was unable to fully separate himself from those solemn heights. He observed the mist rising from the valleys in the mornings, keeping secrets hidden that may never be found. He considered everything he had seen while looking up at the stars over the far-off peaks at night. Grand triumphs or the total annihilation of the evil he had sought were not his legacy. It was in the minor adjustments he had contributed to. Communities were now more watchful, travelers were more circumspect, and others were eager to carry on the task of illuminating shadowy areas. Every now and then, Sarah came to see him and told him about people who had succeeded in starting over. Benjamin had developed into a persuasive speaker who used his narrative to caution others about the perils of loneliness in the absence of moral guidance. Though less often now, the letters continued to arrive. Each one included tales of new difficulties encountered in far-off places, as well as triumphs, of predatory communities destroyed before they could do irreparable harm. Wickham's network, which he had helped create, kept expanding, change and adjust to new circumstances and obstacles, knowing that he was proud of it, that his contributions would endure long after he was gone. Wickham took his final stroll along the paths he was so familiar with on a peaceful autumn afternoon. Around him, golden leaves were gently falling, and the air was chilly, a sign of winter to come. Ascending to a vantage point, he was able to observe miles of mountains extending in all directions, their beauty and peril inseparable. It had been, and most likely would continue to be that way. The Harrows, that mysterious family that had initiated it all, came to mind. Ezekiel and his adherents had long since passed away, but the lessons they imparted were still applicable. Both great goodness and deep darkness were part of human nature. Situational factors, community awareness, and the existence of institutions that served as reminders of people's common humanity frequently determined which side won. Now, Wickham realized that his quest had never really been about apprehending particular offenders. It was about comprehending how the darkness emerged, how it flourished, and how it could be overcome by persistent teamwork rather than a single valiant deed. The darkness was pushed back by every individual who made the decision to take action when they saw injustice. Every community that refused to keep quiet in the face of evil, and every survivor who had the guts to share their story. Numerous tales, some to be unearthed and others to remain eternal mysteries, could be found in the mountains that surrounded them. This thought contained acceptance. It was not possible to know everything. It was impossible to eradicate all darkness. But what characterized civilization at its best was the attempt to try, the refusal to accept evil as inevitable. Wickham went back down to his cabin as the sun started to set, tinting the sky with rich orange and purple hues. He walked with a calmness that came from knowing he had done everything within his power. The shadows that hung between the trees were no longer as menacing as they once were. The shadows were merely a normal aspect of the cycle, between the dark and the light. In the diary he had kept for decades, he wrote his final words that evening. They were neither dramatic declarations nor lofty contemplations. They were straightforward statements about being watchful, supporting one another, and never letting fear of the unknown stop us from taking action. It was his final gift to future generations, serving as a reminder that evil would always find new hiding places, and that every generation should be on guard. That year, the winter winds came early, bringing a silent white mantle of snow that covered the mountains. Wickham's cabin was a lonely reminder of a life lived for something bigger. Through the network he had assisted in building, the lessons he had recorded, the patterns he had discovered, and the stories he had saved would all continue to spread, assisting others on their own journeys through perilous places. Stories were still told around hearths on chilly nights in the villages strewn throughout the mountains. Not the actual accounts of crimes and trials, but versions that have been altered by popular culture. Tales of caution about the perils of solitude and the mysteries of old mountains. As travelers got ready to traverse far-flung areas, the Harrow's name was whispered, turning them into legends and serving as a reminder that not all threats in the woods came from untamed creatures. The mountains persisted, unchanging and unaffected by the human tragedies taking place inside their folds. For generations to come, they would continue to protect secrets, silent but unborn, witnesses to everything humanity was capable of, both horrible and admirable. And there would be hope that light would triumph over darkness, as long as there were people who were prepared to stare at these gloomy locations without turning away, as long as there were people who refused to acknowledge that some things were better left unknowable. For more stories that delve into the forgotten corners of the imagination, think about subscribing to the channel if you've made it this far on this journey through the mountain's shadows. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Additionally, a like goes a long way if you found the content enjoyable.